I'm gonna give you some techniques with the Tree Thrasher that will give you a different approach to calling and make you sound like the real thing, which is absolutely deadly. When it comes to calling mature whitetails, you really have to consider what they have survived in order to reach that age that you're now targeting them at. And in a lot of cases, they've survived in the areas that you've been hunting them and calling at them. So if you think about whether a mature dominant deer is a 2-year-old, 3-year-old, up to a 10-year-old deer, whatever in your area, it doesn't matter. They've survived season after season, hunter after hunter, and encounter after encounter with hunters over the years. Think about how many times they've been rattled at, grunted at, called at by guys who didn't know what they were necessarily doing and educated those animals. And that's what you're up against. There is something that is just plain fun about rattling antlers. I've been doing it years and have been through a lot of different experiences with rattling. I've called some nice bucks in over the years, and have recently kind of come to the conclusion that in my area, I think rattling does more harm than good. It's a lot of fun when you're sitting in a tree stand and you're not seeing anything, and especially you're cold, you're bored. I'm gonna make something happen. So you bang the antlers together, and occasionally you'll call one in, but in my opinion, I think you actually do more harm than good. They sound great and everything when you're up in a tree, but to a deer, they just don't sound realistic. It doesn't sound like two big bucks fighting. When you hear big bucks fighting, generally you hear more noise of all the timber, brush crashing, trees breaking. It sounds like a truck driving through the middle of the timber, and that's the truth. I've only heard it once in 30 years of hunting, but it sounded so unbelievable. Deer came running from all directions, and it was quite obvious what it was. You could barely even hear the antlers, actually. All you could hear was really the crashing and the sound of hooves smashing on the ground. It was just insane, but you can't duplicate that. You can't duplicate that out of a tree stand. Not in the way that bucks hear it. When I started killing these big mature deer, I had to look at how I was approaching it, both in the areas that I was hunting them, how I was accessing those areas, and specifically how I was calling once I got into those areas. You've got deer all around you in a stand. The worst thing that you can do is let the whole neighborhood know that you're there aggressively right out of the gate. You have to approach it much differently if you want to be successful at killing these ghost bucks. Part of the way that I've done it is by minimizing the amount of calling I'm doing, but doing it in a strategic way that sounds unlike any other hunter around me and sounds realistic. And it's all about realism if you want to get these big bucks to come toward your direction without being wary that you're a hunter in the process. My calling strategy has evolved over the years based on my experiences and basically what I've seen in the wild when I've been hunting. The one thing I've kind of come to the conclusion over the years is I want to be as realistic as possible to the natural sounds in the wild and the way these bucks interact and socialize with all the other deer. I don't want to sound like a hunter. I want to sound like a real animal. So part of the strategy that I've created over the years for calling, and I'm very process oriented, I do the same thing over and over and over again, and if I'm not seeing results, then I change that. Once I start to see results, then I like to duplicate that over and over and over again. So my calling strategy before Tree Thrasher had evolved to the point where I was basically grunting once every 20 to 30 minutes, sometimes with my voice, sometimes with a grunt tube. The number one thing, each time I grunted, I always wanted it to sound a bit different, and I would always try to change the direction. So I'd either use my hand, use my grunt tube, but I'd call in multiple directions and only a single time. The reason I only use one grunt at a time is because it's generally more realistic and it's much more difficult for those animals to pinpoint your exact location. It's kind of like the old slogan or phrase that if you shoot twice, the enemy knows exactly where you're at, but if you shoot once, they don't have a clue because that's the first time they hear it, they don't quite know where it's at. The mystery is what you have to create in your calling situations. Now the Tree Thrasher fits perfectly right into my calling strategy because it gives me a tool to make additional noises with my grunts that sound like a real buck. So the Tree Thrasher makes three primary sounds. The first is the sound of antlers on a tree, rubbing a tree. Now each tree is a little bit different, so you're gonna get different sounds from each one, but that's the beauty of the Tree Thrasher is that if it doesn't sound right, just don't use it. Some barks sound different than others. So in that situation, that sounds pretty good to me. That sounds more like antlers on a tree. The other thing you gotta consider is big bucks generally do not do the same action for more than 10 to 15 seconds at a time. They're not sitting there rubbing and rubbing and rubbing for an hour straight. They like to rub, scrape, make their noise, and they always will pause about every 15 seconds. It is a reason just for survival, I think. They want to stop, they want to listen, look, see what's in the area, and then they feel comfortable making more noise. The second sound that the tree thrasher makes is obviously the leaf thrashing sounds. Now you can make a lot of different varieties of sound, and if you watched or heard different bucks making these noises over the past, I designed this call to basically mimic several different scenarios. The first is obviously a buck that's thrashing trees, thrashing leaves. The second is the sound of a deer actually walking. The third is the sound of a hoof stomp. Depending on the situation that I'm in, I'll mix it up, and I always want to use different calls throughout my hunt so that I'm not continuing to replicate or duplicate the same thing over and over and over again, because that's not natural. Every single time a buck makes a rub, a scrape, whatever, it always sounds a little bit different, which is the cool thing about the tree thrasher is you really can't screw it up, but you can overuse it. I'm going to teach you the best ways to use these and keep it simple and smart when it comes to your calling. The third sound that the tree thrasher makes is the branch break sound. And there's something unmistakable about that noise when you're in the field. The sound of a breaking branch indicates only one thing to me: a large-bodied animal moving through the timber. If it's not a buck intentionally raking a tree, thrashing a tree, making that breaking branches sound, it's generally from walking around in the timber. But only large animals make them. So that, couple branch breaks, send a huge message. The thing that makes the tree thrasher call so cool is that you can create the individual noises that we've been talking about, or layer them together in a symphony of sounds. Basically what I'm trying to do is duplicate the sound of a big buck making a rub, thrashing its antlers, following it up with a scrape, which is a very common situation. So I like to start my scenarios off with basically the sound of a buck just walking up to a tree, making some rubbing sounds. Now this noise itself should not be crazy loud. Generally, if you're watching a buck make a rub, you only hear the actual rubbing sounds a little bit. Most of the other noise there is antlers hitting the brush, hitting the leaves, and that's what you want to duplicate. So I like to start by just making a little bit of a rubbing noise, maybe for 5 to 10 seconds tops. Then I take a break and I wait. And I wait at least 5 to 10 seconds because that's natural and that's what a buck would do in the timber. Now I throw in branch break, break again, and maybe 1/3. That's where I stop. You let it simmer, you let that animal think about what's going on over there, and then what I like to do is I like to follow it up with one single grunt about 30 seconds later. Beep. Now the animal heard that ruckus, heard the grunt, puts 2 and 2 together. Okay, I know what that is. The beauty of that is it antagonizes them. My entire calling sequence with the tree thrasher is usually only 20 to 30 seconds. I just don't want to go beyond that time because it's not natural. Usually bucks like to make noise and then they'll stop, they'll look, they'll listen. So I want to duplicate the natural habits of whitetails. The other part of this is you don't have to use all the sounds together. I like to break up my thrashing sessions with different sounds. The sounds of a buck making a scrape. Pause. That sounds like a buck making a scrape, switching legs, going to the other side. The other thing, if you want to do a call that sounds like a buck walking through the timber and grunting. Beep. Sounds like hooves on the leaves, very, very natural sound. And again, you can do these different noises throughout your hunt, make it sound different so you're not doing the same thrash session over and over and over. And in fact, in a 2 to 3 hour hunt, I'm only going to do 2 to 3 thrash sessions, usually once a little early on, once about prime time, and then once right before I leave, just to make sure that anything that's close to me in the neighborhood that's going to hear me walk out or potentially see me walk out, I have a chance of calling them in. But the number one thing with the tree thresher is a little goes a long ways. You can overcall with this just like any call, but if you use it in moderation, simply making a few noises, along with a grunt at the beginning or a grunt at the end, it will absolutely blow your mind how many deer will come to you, including does. They hear that noise, they associate a real animal, they want to know what's over there. You've created a safe zone for them, because any buck that's making intentional noise is not doing it where they don't feel secure. So by basically putting that noise out there, you're essentially letting all the other deer in the area know that this is safe, come on over, see what's going on. So the tree thrasher works, I've used it and I've called a bunch of deer in with it. Let me help you become a better caller, but more is not better in this case. You've got to take it easy, use it minimally, tease them, antagonize them, and trust me, they will come into your stand.